Hi, folks. You know, the left loves to treat reality like it's optional, and there's no greater example of that than Twitch streamer Hasan Piker, who recently declared that communist China is probably the closest example America should learn from, which is a bold take from a guy who melts down if Starbucks runs out of soy milk. Hasan made this declaration on his recent appearance on the Triggernometry podcast, an appearance he did after spending an entire month in China, quite literally shilling for the Chinese government in ways that go beyond what most Americans could ever understand. Hasan Piker was out there being handed Mao's Little Red Book as a cute souvenir, the same Little Red Book written by a dictator who killed tens of millions of his own people, including many Christians. And Hasan received it with shock and awe, like he'd just been gifted a rare collectible. He spent the last few weeks in China making a full-throated argument for why China is a terrific country, all while pretending to refute American consumerism, even as he fetishized Chinese products like a tourist in a state-approved gift shop. It was your typical leftist propaganda tour, paint America as the great source of evil in human history while uplifting an oppressive regime currently holding more than 1 million people in concentration camps and responsible for one of the most grotesque state-run organ harvesting operations in modern history. And now, in his latest sit-down on Triggernometry, Hasan continued the propaganda, which is rich, coming from the same man who has openly defended terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah over the last few years. He has now found a new point of ideological conflict he can exploit for money within American culture, pushing the murderous communist propaganda of a country openly trying to undermine the United States and undo us from within. And for anyone doubting the extent of China's subversion of America, let's be crystal clear. China is one of the biggest funders of transgender ideological activism globally, with several Chinese billionaires funding U.S.-based nonprofits and media efforts that push gender ideology on children. China is also the country whose chemical companies produce and export the precursors that fuel America's fentanyl crisis, materials that flow directly to the Mexican cartels, who then smuggle the final product over our southern border illegally, driving a generational population collapse within America. Those are just 2 points, folks. We're not even touching on the other ways China funds propaganda and cultural destabilization, one of them through people like Piker. Now, during this interview with Triggernometry, many people claim Hasan appeared more reasonable than ever. They say he's dialing back his extremism. He's admitted before that he does this deliberately in interviews because it makes him more palatable. His entire strategy is to handhold you slowly into his extremist ideology, and his end goal, something he's not even hiding anymore, is to drive America toward a communist state. Needless to say, at this point, it's fair to wonder whether Piker should be registered under FARA. Obviously, this would be unprecedented for an American citizen, but when you have an American influencer constantly shilling for foreign governments, parroting their propaganda, even terroristic propaganda, and openly advocating for their political models over his own country, it's hard to argue that he's actually a net positive for the United States.
You said something interesting because, you know, I was born in the Soviet Union, so we both have direct experience of socialism in various shapes and forms. You talked about, well, there's positives and there's negatives. So is there a country that's done socialism the way that you like?
I would say that I am hypercritical of all forms of governance, including the American one. I think that's not a surprise to you guys, right? And in that same vein, I think like there is critiques to apply to all forms of governance, even socialist ones.
Yeah.
And as far as like getting closer to what I think has been relatively successful, because if ultimately the point of government is to improve the material conditions of all people to the best of your ability, it's not always going to be perfect, but when you are getting, I don't know, the poorest people, the poorest of the dispossessed masses out of a situation where they were servile, the landed gentry, or they were peasants from an agrarian society, or they were dominated by the landlords, but then ultimately they were able to come into modernity and become like a powerhouse, an industrial powerhouse that is competitive with the largest superpower on the planet. I would say if that's the point of good governance, and I think you guys might agree with me on that, I would say China is probably the closest. And there are still plenty of failures within the Chinese system as well, plenty of issues within the Chinese system as well. But that's probably the closest, I would say, to an example that we should follow and lessons that we should learn from. This is something that I talk about quite a bit. Ironically enough, we only utilize some of the most repressive elements of Chinese governance here in the United States of America, especially in the second Trump administration, and none of the good stuff.
For anybody with even a shred of common sense, that comment alone should have been enough to completely shoot Hasan Piker's credibility. First off, he is selectively looking at China's transition from an agrarian society into a modern industrial state, while totally ignoring the fact that the United States went through the same transition, arguably more cleanly, far more sustainably, and undeniably faster. Why? Well, because we had the mechanism of unfettered capitalism and decentralized innovation pushing this rapid development. It's also interesting that Hasan makes this clear distinction between China and America by calling America the superpower as if that status is some kind of accident. Folks, America has been around for 250 years. China, in one form or another, has existed for thousands. Yes, fractured at times, unified at times, but still a civilization stretching millennia. And yet America, an infant nation, blew past China in economic power, productivity, civil liberties, technological innovation, and quality of life in just a few generations. So ask yourself how that happened. Ask yourself how a country that started thousands of years later managed to surpass an ancient civilization with such ease. That's not a mystery, folks. That's the power of freedom, free enterprise, limited government, and the American model. So when Hasan talks about what lessons America should learn from China, the irony is staggering. China only achieved its current level of development by copying us, by loosening its communist command economy, adopting market reforms, allowing selective private enterprise, and letting capitalism generate wealth under a very tight authoritarian leash. So what Hasan calls success is actually China stepping away from communism, not actually embracing it. And even then, it's a very selective state-dominated top-down form of capitalist socialism that remains deeply unfree. Hasan himself experienced that firsthand when a Chinese handler checked in on him over a joke he made on stream while he was in China. A reminder that the Chinese state doesn't tolerate even the kind of mild edginess he performs in his LA studio. So the question becomes, what lessons exactly should America learn? Because the only coherent lesson here is that the more China imitates America, the richer it becomes. And the more it slips back towards socialism and communism, the poorer and more repressive it gets. But Hasan's framing isn't just wrong, folks. It's also extremely disingenuous. It's a rewriting of history that erases the American story entirely. He pretends America stumbled into global dominance, but the truth is that America unlocked human potential in a way no government-planned society ever has. And the left hates admitting this because it undermines their entire ideological framework. And that's the real engine behind this moment, folks. A left that has lost faith in America, lost interest in liberty, and genuinely believes that authoritarian efficiency is morally superior. And by the way, Hasan isn't an outlier. He's the logical endpoint of a generation taught to see America as the villain of the world and to treat its unprecedented achievements as accidents rather than outcomes of a unique system. Meanwhile, the only way China even competes with us at all today is by undermining America from within, by stealing intellectual property, by manipulating our markets, by funding propaganda networks, by exploiting our institutions, and by leveraging our cultural fractures. China's rise isn't powered by socialism or communism. It's powered by America's openness, America's innovation, and America's willingness to let ideas thrive and actually fund their economy by manufacturing everything there. And ironically, if Hasan actually got the socialist state he wants, he wouldn't be allowed to say any of this, or even a moderately sanitized version of it. This is why America doesn't need lessons from China. In fact, if anything, America needs to be more American. More freedoms, more economic dynamism, more entrepreneurial spirit, less bureaucracy, less regulation, less of the managerial political class that smothers growth and innovation. America needs a return to the principles that built the most successful country in human history, not a flirtation with the ideology that destroyed tens of millions of Chinese lives and still keeps an entire population under digital surveillance and restrictive one-party rule. And that's the irony of this entire conversation. The left claims to speak for human rights, for equality and liberation. Yet its loudest influencers keep pointing to the world's most authoritarian regimes as models for the future. It's not ignorance, folks. That's clear ideological capture. And if we don't recognize it for what it is, we risk sleepwalking into the very system we once defeated with nothing but freedom and conviction.
We don't have any high-speed rail. We don't have any even development. There is seemingly nothing to look forward to in America in terms of economic prosperity, in terms of
what are you talking
overall
about?
health of society, in terms of scientific achievements. And I think a lot of younger people also feel the same way, where they feel like there's nothing to look forward to here. And I'll give you guys an example from the UK. I remember seeing this TikTok of this guy that goes around and is like asking young British people, would they serve in the British military? And I am not even remotely nationalistic by any measure. I don't care about those sorts of things. But I think it's important to understand, like, it's a good way to see the temperature of society. And a lot of the young British people were like, no, why would I fight for England?
Again, these are all retarded points. Who gives a fuck about a high-speed rail? Seriously. America has one of the most developed, affordable, and extensive air travel systems in the entire world. And let's be honest, why would I spend $150 or maybe even $50 to sit on a high-speed rail where the fastest theoretical travel time from San Diego to San Francisco is still 5 to 6 hours? Why would I do that when I can hop on a plane and get there in half the time or less, often for half the price? Why? Why is there this liberal obsession with building a high-speed rail network, one of the most inefficient ways to travel in a country as geographically large and decentralized as the United States? There's a reason America stopped expanding long-distance passenger rail in the first place. It's costly to build, it's costly to maintain, slow by comparison, and incredibly expensive for taxpayers. It's not good governance. It's not good economics, and it's definitely not a smart way to move people across a continent-sized country. But this is the perfect example of how the modern left substitutes real ideas for aesthetic fantasies. Instead of policy, they have aspirational construction projects that sound visionary but function as generational grifts, monuments to crony capitalism dressed up as progress. Look at California's bullet train. They promised the public a sleek, modern rail system connecting major cities. What do we get? Less than a fraction of it built. Tens of billions of dollars burned through, massive delays, no real connection between major population centers, and no accountability for where the money went. And everyone knows it will never be finished. Why? Well, because it was never about benefiting Americans or Californians. It was about funneling money into a political machine that disguises graft as infrastructure. So when Hasan Piker frames America's lack of high-speed rail as evidence that there's nothing to look forward to, he's not just wrong, he's revealing the ideological echo chamber he lives in. He genuinely believes that symbolic mega projects are a measure of national health for some reason. But Americans already have a transportation system that works. Fast flights, competitive pricing, rental cars on arrival, mobility on demand. What's wrong with that? Nothing. The only people who think it's a problem are people whose political identity is built around complaining that America never does enough to live up to their imagined utopia. Then there's this whole point about nationalism and young people lacking a sense of purpose or belonging. And this one is uniquely absurd coming from Hasan because he himself is one of the leading contributors to that exact crisis. When influential left-wing commentators spend years preaching that America is collapsing, that capitalism is evil, that the future is just hopeless, that the West is dying, that the country is irredeemably racist or oppressive or broken beyond repair, what do you think is going to happen to the younger generation listening to them? There's a reason why leftists statistically report higher levels of depression and anxiety than their conservative peers. It's because their worldview creates hopelessness. It is a doom and gloom all the time shoved down their throats by influencers like Hasan Piker, media institutions, and academic frameworks that reward this sort of cynicism while mocking gratitude, patriotism, and personal agency. And this leads to the broader point, folks. What we're seeing with Hasan Piker isn't just a bad take. It's a symptom of a deeper ideological shift on the left. Their worldview has become entirely downstream from despair. The modern left doesn't build, it just laments. It doesn't inspire, it catastrophizes. It defines America not by its unmatched success, but by its imperfections. And that pessimism becomes the foundation for their admiration of authoritarian systems like China. They look at China and see discipline, direction, competence, quote unquote, and the illusion of collective purpose. They contrast that with America's openness, freedom, messiness, and decentralized innovation, and they call our system broken. They contrast that with America's openness, freedom, individual liberties and accountability, self-determination, and decentralized innovation, and they call our system broken for some reason. But here's the truth, folks. America isn't broken. It's just not built on the values. We don't need a planned economy to feel modern. And we certainly don't need to model our country after an authoritarian surveillance state that crushes dissent, controls information, and manufactures the illusion of efficiency through repression. The left's fascination with China isn't about China at all. It's about their dissatisfaction with America. It's a longing for control disguised as admiration for progress. So when Hasan Piker says young people feel like there's nothing to look forward to, he's accidentally admitting something very important. The left's worldview has failed to give people meaning. It can tear down, criticize, and shame all day, but it can't build hope. And until that changes, we're going to see more influencers like Hasan Piker romanticizing authoritarian regimes because they confuse control with competence and repression with some form of progress.
I understand there's some really bad situations for people. People should also know that in the UK, there's also lots of people who are dying without care because they're waiting for an operation for a year and a half, or they're waiting 2 months for a scan. Yes. But let's not get into that.
No, but the NHS is, you're right. The NHS has had significant austerity measures implemented to it.
The NHS budget keeps growing every year, but it doesn't matter.
Because the population is growing.
Let's not get into it.
Absolutely destroyed. That's just embarrassing at this point. And we're only watching a few clips from the whole interview. Needless to say, there's a lot more there, but this particular exchange gives us the ideological core of who Hasan Piker really is. He's a fraud. He really is. And he exposes himself every time he's forced into a moment where rhetoric collides with reality. He tried to slip in this lazy talking point about austerity measures in the NHS, hoping nobody would call him out on it. And immediately, Konstantin shuts it down with a basic fact: the NHS budget increases every single year. And instead of addressing that, Hasan pivots to, well, of course, the population keeps growing. And this is where it gets remarkable, folks, because he was so close to understand the actual issue. And then he swerved right away because the populational growth in the UK, similar to the US, has been overwhelmingly driven by immigration. And the healthcare system cannot sustain the increased demand, then naturally, as a result, the material quality of the healthcare service is going to get worse. And that's not xenophobia, folks. It's not ideology. That's just clear mathematics. If inflow exceeds capacity, outcome declines. Outcomes decline. This isn't a complex equation, but this is where the modern left has trapped itself. They cannot acknowledge that immigration has any material downside ever. So even when the logic is right in front of them, they bend themselves into knots to avoid admitting that people living in these systems, what people living in the systems already know. And this is the deeper problem with these self-branded prophetic truth tellers. They just fabricate talking points, hoping no one challenges them. When confronted with facts, they fold instantly and retreat into platitudes. This is what propagandists do, folks. And Hasan has openly called himself a propagandist. These aren't intellectuals. He's not an influencer. He's an influencer pretending to be a historian. But let's actually talk about the substance here, okay? Because nationalized healthcare systems are inherently inefficient compared to mixed or competitive systems. That's not an ideological claim, folks. That's empirical reality. The NHS is permanently in crisis. Canada's wait times get longer every year. Scandinavian systems, often held up as a gold standard, are quietly reintroducing private competition to keep costs under control. These systems ration care because they have to. When the government becomes the single payer, scarcity becomes the default. Now, before Obamacare, if we can remember that, the United States did not have nearly 100% coverage. That's the part that needs correcting. Now, before Obamacare, if we can take a dive back and remember that, We had a system where the overwhelming majority of Americans were insured through employers, where competition kept innovation alive, and where the uninsured population was largely handled through state-level solutions, charity care, catastrophic plans, and Medicaid. It wasn't perfect, but it was materially far more functional than the system we have now. What the Affordable Care Act did was impose a sweeping one-size-fits-all model onto 330 million people. It was sold as a reform for the uninsured, but it became a draconian regulatory imposition on everyone else. It inflated premiums, narrowed doctor networks, created an unconstitutional tax penalty that had to be gutted by the Supreme Court, and turned healthcare into a bureaucratic labyrinth. And it has absolutely contributed to the massive inflation of healthcare costs over the last decade. The problems it claimed to address were not solved at all. They were just redistributed, buried, or worsened. Meanwhile, the only places where quasi-universal coverage works in America are at the state level, Medi-Cal in California being a prime example. But even here, the system is riddled with fraud and abuse. Last year's budget deficit in California was directly inflated by billions in Medi-Cal expenditures for illegal immigrants. People who entered the country immediately accessed the social safety net and contributed nothing to the system beforehand. That's not, needless to say, folks, that is not sustainable. And it absolutely should be illegal to impose those costs on taxpayers without consent. And this brings us to the bigger picture, the reason this moment matters. The left has spent years trying to convince the younger generation that the West is dying, that capitalism is collapsing, that systems like the NHS are victims of austerity, and that the only thing preventing a utopian world is conservative cruelty. But the moment you strip away the narrative, what's left is a simple truth. Systems fail when they take in more than they can sustain. Institutions collapse when political ideology replaces basic math, and public discourse becomes delusional when influencers like Hasan Piker, who don't understand economics, become the moral referees of society. Hasan Piker isn't the cause of this decline, he's a symptom of it. He represents a broader cultural shift on the left, the rejection of responsibility, the rejection of reality, the embrace of rhetoric over actual results. And until that changes, we're going to keep seeing this same pattern. Systems overwhelmed, budgets strained, services deteriorating, and influencers pretending it's all caused by anything except the obvious. If America wants a functional healthcare system, it doesn't need more central planning. It needs competition, deregulation, transparency, and a return to the idea that the government exists to ensure access, not to micromanage an entire industry. Free markets aren't the enemy, folks. They are the only mechanism that consistently lowers costs and raises quality in the long run. And that's the part the left still refuses to understand. So we have to ask ourselves, folks, are we going to keep outsourcing our judgment to people who speak confidently but think shallowly? Are we finally ready to demand something more honest than slogans and emotional shortcuts? How long can a nation endure when its loudest cultural voices tell the next generation that excellence is some form of oppression, that scarcity is sabotage, and that decline is inevitable? And at what point do ordinary Americans look at the narratives being fed to them and ask, does any of this actually make sense? Because ultimately, the health of a society, its institutions, its freedoms, its prosperity, depends on its ability to distinguish truth from performance. And if we lose that, folks, it won't be because of one influencer or one commitment to communism or other ideologies. It will be because we stopped questioning the stories we were being told. Anyway, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. Hope you have a terrific day. Peace.